So I would like to introduce Gary Cornell, who so graciously agreed to talk with us today about a story from his upcoming book, correct?
Yes.
All right. It's all yours, Gary.
Okay. I'm going to move forward just a little bit. I feel like you're way back there and I'm way up here. As Ms. Weaver told you, I am Gary Cornell. I'm a retired firefighter from here in East Liverpool. I've been retired for several years, and although while I was at work, I was the self-proclaimed historian of the fire department. There's no such title, but I took that title on myself through the years because of my love for history. And I carried that on. We have a small museum at the fire station, and I was sort of the curator and you know, identifying pictures and stories and things of that sort. And I started to put it down in a book, and I wrote a book that was basically finished in 1996 but never published because it was too expensive and I didn't do it. And then after I retired, my son purchased for me a series of books about short stories of murders and fires and disasters and things of that sort having to do in the Cleveland area. And I thought, hey, I know stories just as good as those took place right here. And I said, I could write a book like that. And my son told me, well, then why don't you? Well, that was something that had never really occurred to me to do. And I thought to myself, well, then why don't I? And I put together a book that came out in 2015 called Dark Days, and was blessed and very well received, surprisingly, because I was very skeptical of my audience, but it became very popular around the area. I was blessed by that. And people said, when is your next book coming out? And I thought, well, I didn't know that I was actually writing the next book. But I did. And this book will be out in the fall. It's a sequel to Dark Days. And the title of this new book is called Unearthed. And I came up with that title with the idea of not wanting to call the book Dark Days 2 or Son of Dark Days or, you know, Bride of Dark Days, you know. And I didn't want to do any of that, and it was like people were giving me titles, and I thought, no. And then in the research of the story, a headline in an old newspaper said, Unearthed. And I thought, wow, that's catchy. So I decided that would be the title because that's what I'm doing. I'm unearthing old stories from our past, the history that has been forgotten by most, unwritten about for 100 years or more, and I'm digging these stories up, unearthing the history and bringing it back. So I think it's a great title. I decided to give you a story from the upcoming book. In most cases when I do stories, I like to delve into the thing and get as much of the first-hand facts as I can get, dispel the old myths that might have been built up over the years as best I can, or at least that I feel comfortable with, and put down the true, accurate story as I can put down from as many sources gathered as I can gather. That's my mantra. This story's a little different. As I was doing some research, I ran across the story from 1891 in a Lisbon newspaper. Lisbon in those days had two newspapers, the Patriot and the Buckeye State, and they were weeklies. And the Buckeye State had a story in the paper from April 16th, 1891, and it said that an old log cabin was being torn down, and as they were taking the logs apart, they found a package wrapped up, tight little package. They opened it up, and in there was $7,000 in gold coins. And it ran in the paper and said that they had found this treasure. $7,000 in 1891 was a lot more than $7,000 today. Buying power. It was a fortune. The newspaper editor of the Buckeye State said, "I'm not sure that's accurate. We didn't see the money. Nobody showed us the money or anything. It could be just the ramblings of some country bumpkin, so to speak, who wanted his name in the paper." Well, like I say, it was a weekly. So a whole week goes by to April 23rd, and then there's a little story that says, "Oh, by the way, that was a complete hoax. There was no $7,000 in that old house. That was a complete, unadulterated campaign lie." Which made me think about the campaign, you know, and was this a politically motivated thing? So I'm trying to put this in my mind, and I'm scanning through the paper, and it was election time, and there was only one person running for office from that township, Hanover Township, because this took place near Hanoverton. And he was in a four-way race for sheriff. And I thought, well, would the $7,000 be part of a robbery maybe, that this guy maybe had some connection to, a family member or something, somebody trying to discredit him, somebody trying to help his campaign? He didn't win. I done that, but I don't know where that $7,000 played into this, except that it stirred up old memories. In that same paper, page later, was a short story written by a guy who was not named, but was described as being a respected, older gentleman from the area who wanted to get something off his chest. And he said that the owner of that cabin, that farm, was a man by the name of David Miller. And David Miller was described in the paper by this gentleman as being a very large man. Enormous, he said. Perhaps the heaviest, biggest man in Columbiana County. He said he was a recluse, kind of a strange guy. And one day, he said, a neighbor went to his house to check on something or see him about something, and when he got there, the door to the cabin was standing open. And he hollered and looked in, and there he found Miller hanging from a rafter, apparently a suicide. Well, being a recluse, nobody was there to take care of him, so a group of concerned citizens from the village of Hanoverton decided that they would take it upon themselves to give him a proper burial. So they took and they built an oversized coffin, and they found a place on the Miller farm, and they dug an oversized grave, and they put him in it. And they buried him, and they went about their business for a day. The next day, people were in the tavern. And in those days, they didn't have medical schools like they do today. And one of the things that took place was doctors who were in practice and had been in practice a long time would take on apprentices, so to speak. and students would come and study under this doctor to become doctors themselves. Now we're talking not 1891, we're talking 50 years. I forgot to tell you, 50 years in the past, 1840s. So this doctor had, in Hanoverton, had several young apprentice doctors working under him. And a group of them was in the tavern, and they were talking. And they said, we need a body. We need something that we can dissect, something that we can learn how the body works and how the muscles work and, you know, the whole thing. And we need to find one. And I heard that this guy Miller just died. And they buried him yesterday. And he's out on a farm, secluded. We could dig him up. We could take him back to the doctor's office and we could study. And as they drank their beer and they talked, the voices got a little bit louder and the plan became a little bit more developed, and they were overheard by a concerned citizen. In those days, that was looked on as very bad. You know, you don't dig up grandma and take her somewhere and cut her up. Even though David Miller was not everybody's friend, they weren't about to let that happen. So the group of concerned citizens of Hanoverton got together and they began to discuss, what are we going to do? And it kind of probably went something like this. Well, you know what they're going to do. They're going to dig him up. They're going to cut him up into pieces. And my goodness, we can't allow that. What kind of Christian men would we be if we allowed that to happen? We've got to do something. And the next guy says, well, yeah, we got to do something, but what? I don't know what to do. And they said, well, we need to put a guard on his grave. Somebody needs to stand guard over that grave to keep that from happening. And the guy says, well, it ain't going to be me. I'm not going out there and stand in the dark all night long in the woods. You know, I'm not doing it. And it went back and forth and back and forth. And finally, they looked over on the side, and there sat a man who had not said anything, but just sat and listened. And it was a man named Joseph Walker, who was a blacksmith, a big, strong, stout man. A man known to be courageous and brave and true. A man just like they were looking for. The perfect grave guard that would be able to stand all night and face the danger. And all eyes slowly shifted to Joe Walker, and to where finally Joe Walker was like, okay, I guess I can do it. I don't want to do it, but if you think it's what we need to do, I'll do it. And they're like, yeah. And they all came, shook Joe's hand, and you're the man. And that night, Joe Walker went out to the grave just about dusk. And he sat all night listening to the owls hoot and the bushes rustle from the night creatures as they prowled in the dark. And he probably thought to himself, what in the world am I doing sitting out here in the woods in the middle of the night? This is stupid. The next day, nothing happened. The next day, he was back at his forge working, and I'm sure the thoughts went through his mind of, why in the world am I doing this? But that night, he was back because he was a man of character and a man who said he would do what he would do. So that night he's back, still full of doubts, and he's sitting against a tree and it's pitch dark. There's not a sound. And then slowly, faintly, you start to hear the clip-clop of horses' hoofs striking on hard ground. and then the squeak of wagon wheels and wood. And Joe Walker's alert now, and he's looking, and he's peering into the darkness, and slowly this image starts to come out of the darkness of a wagon pulled by 2 horses. And there's several people on the wagon. And he's a little scared now. So he steps back into the bushes, kind of out of sight. The wagon pulls up to the grave. And then in a scene you've all seen in horror movies, I'm sure, your whole life, these guys get off the wagon and they circle around the grave and they stand and they look at this freshly disturbed earth, and their quiet whispers, afraid to awaken some spirit or whatever. They finally get a couple shovels off the wagon, and a couple of them start to dig. Joe Walker says to himself, "Now is the time I must act." They had a lantern lit there, but it was just casting a small circle of light, and he was outside that circle. He stepped into the circle of light. They all had their backs to him, and he hollered, "What in God's name are you doing?" Well, shrieks went up. People jumped. People were like scared out of their wits. Who in the world? Where did this guy come from? One of the men with the shovel instinctively swung the shovel at the guy and struck Joe Walker with the shovel, knocked him down. Joe Walker, now fearful for his own life, he's got a pistol. He pulls the pistol out and shoots. The fire shoots out the end of the pistol, illuminates the scene, and the guy that hit him with the shovel grabs his stomach and lets out a low moan and falls to the ground. Joe Walker sitting on the ground with a smoking pistol in his hand. The other men quickly grab up their friend, put him in the wagon, jump on, whip the horses, and away they go into the darkness, leaving Joe sitting on the ground in the lantern light, wondering what has taken place. A few minutes, he gains his composure, he jumps up, hurries back to town, wakes up his friends, tells them, "People came, they tried to rob the grave. I shot one of them. I think I killed him. What are we going to do?" His friend said, "Oh, just be quiet. Don't say anything. You don't know if you hurt him. You don't know what the situation is. Just pretend it never happened. It'll go away. We'll be fine." Nobody went back to the grave that night. The next morning, a group of men from the town went out to the graveside. They dug up David Miller's casket. They dug a pit 10 feet square, 8 feet deep. In the center of that pit, they dug another grave and put his casket in it and covered it over. Then they cut logs 10 foot long, and they laid them in the pit, some this way, so that they were cross of each other, all tangled, and they filled the pit in. They said that anybody that tries to dig him up now is going to have a problem. They're going to be not going to be able to get it done in one night. He said it was possibly the most unique tomb ever to be done here in Columbiana County, according to the paper. And this guy, we presume, is Joe Walker, tells his story to get it off his chest. 50 years has gone by. And he wasn't named in the story, but he said, that's what happened. There was also a little addition to the story which said that several days after this incident, a man from Wellsville happened to come up to Hanoverton, traveling, and as they did, they would go to the tavern and to eat and relax and socialize, and people would know that a stranger was in town, and they would come there and have a conversation and want to know, what's going on down in Wellsville. My goodness, that's almost 30 miles away. Nobody ever goes that far. Never saw the place in my life, but I'd like to know what's going on down there. And this guy begins to tell of the events of Wellsville, and then he said, oh, by the way, there was a young doctor in town that just all of a sudden up and died. Nobody knows what happened to him. One day he was there, the next day he was dead. Everybody in the tavern kind of looked at each other, not a word said. The guy went about his business, and life returned as normal in 1844 Hanover. 50 years went by, 1891, almost 50 years, and Joe Walker's telling the story. Need to get it off my chest. Page later, you turn the page to the newspaper, it's another story of another old, well-respected doctor who spent years in the medical practice, who was intrigued by the $7,000 gold story, and he too wants to get off his chest. And he says, I was one of the grave robbers. I was with the group that tried to dig up the grave. My friend was shot and died before we could get him back to town. And we, the doctors, the young medical students, all said, shut up. Nobody's going to want to know that we were trying to dig up this grave. It'll ruin us. We'll cover the story up and pretend it never happened. The doctor wasn't named, but he said, this was true, this happened. So, I, as the crack historian that I am, tried to delve into this deeper. This was an intriguing story. It's one of, I didn't start out looking for it. I found it, unearthed it. So I began to look, and I'm trying to figure, okay, 50 years, because they're talking 50 years. When would that be? Okay, so I'm looking through everything, trying to find David Miller. And I find Nicholas Miller, and I find all these other Millers, but I don't find David Miller. And I'm thinking, okay, is this just a fairy tale? What is this? And then I find in the Buckeye another story, kind of a letter to the editor, from a man named Batten. Didn't give his first name, just Mr. Batten from Kensington, Ohio, a few miles away from Hanoverton. And he said, David Miller didn't hang himself in a cabin. He hung himself on a fence out in his field. I was a kid, a young boy, and it affected me my whole life because of that. He said, he lived with his two sisters and one of the sisters' husbands. And he wasn't a recluse. When he committed suicide, they had an autopsy and an inquest and everything, because they were afraid that maybe he was crazy, and they were trying to figure that out, why he would kill himself. And I don't remember anything about a grave being dug and logs being put in it. But I do remember somebody got shot, and everybody was excited about that. And that was the end of that story. And I thought, okay, you know, it's getting me going here. I found in the paper, the Ohio Patriot of 1844, Lisbon paper, the story of David Miller's demise. And it says, on March 22nd, 1844, David Miller committed suicide by hanging himself on a fence while laboring under a fit of mental distress. It is said that it is because he owed a debt that he could not repay. The Patriot called him, however, a well-managing farmer of easy circumstances. So you would think that he had some money, perhaps $7,000 in gold coins. The debt of money was said to be rather small, and his body was found not long after the deed. But the paper didn't comment on the grave. So I thought, well, okay. There's a modicum of truth in this with a whole lot of speculation. But then I found out something else. Out in the village of Hanoverton today, on Plymouth Street, is a 2-story brick house. And it is said that a doctor by the name of James Robertson practiced there from 1823 to 1867. And what is interesting about that house is that in the upstairs southwest corner is a room that has no door. The only way you can get into the room is through a window. Now, local legend has it that illegal autopsies were done within that small window or doorless room, and perhaps even runaway slaves were hidden there. The house still stands, I'm told. I've not been in the room that has no door. But there's the story. I titled this story, Caveat Lector, which is Latin, which means let the reader beware, because it is full of truth, half-truths, and downright lies. So, I hope you enjoyed it. Any questions?
What happened to the $7,000?
It maybe went into a campaign purse, or maybe didn't exist at all. I don't know.
Well, let's give him a hand.